Anthony Padone for a series called SQL Server in 10 Minutes. We're going to discuss various topics concerning SQL Server and SQL in 10 minutes. This topic happens to be with QueryStore, and it'll be within 10 minutes. And my job here is actually to break down the components of the QueryStore process so we can understand it at different levels. So I'm going to click my timer, hit start, and let's go. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is look at the QueryStore architecture. And let me just explain that a bit. The QueryStore is broken down into various components. We have two components. The QueryStore also is broken down into objects. The objects are the entities or the catalog views that house information about the runtime statistics and compilation statistics. But these are objects housed as named as catalog views, and we can review them as tables. And the QueryStore attributes are the actual values, the actual elements that hold the values of the metrics and the various descriptions about runtime and compilation times. Okay, and you can view them as columns. Let's get into components. Okay, as I mentioned, the components, as far as QueryStore, there are two major components. We do know that a picture is worth 1,000 words and a diagram is probably worth 1,000,000. So we have the QueryStore components, the QueryStore. It's going to have storage of metrics and descriptions about the compilation and execution. So component 1 is the compilation process. Component 2 is the execution process. The compilation process has objects. The objects are the catalog views, which is the query text and the query. And it then creates and houses compilation collection of metrics about the compilation process. The next component is the execution process, of which the query then becomes a compiled plan, of which then the plan has runtime statistics collected within the runtime stats, and also the query plan also then stores, also from the plan, we're storing weight types into the weight stats. So we have compilation process 1, execution process 2. Objects within the compilation, one-to-many text to query. Execution process, we have objects, which is the plan, the collection of stats, weight stats. As we can see, one plan to many runtime stats, one plan to many weight stats, runtime collection. Please review that after our discussion. Thank you. Also, we're going to get into the objects. The objects are the catalog views that we discussed real quickly. We broke it down into two main categories. Core objects, as you can see, reference objects. As you can see, there's an association between the core objects and the reference objects. The core objects, as we talked about, are text, query, the plan. Then the plan is executed, and then the runtime stats collects information about the runtime stats, and the weight stats collects weights that SQL Server is experiencing during the execution. So we have the core. Now there's an association to a referenced group of catalog views or tables. As you can see, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 known reference tables. These also are get and set, meaning I can reference information or get information from this table and also change information. I can get and change it, get and set. I can just get information from here, and I can just get information about the runtime stats interval. So core, which are again the text, which is the code, the query, which is the compiled execution process of the text, then it becomes a query plan for execution. When it's executed, runtime stats collects information about the runtime metrics, and the weight stats collects information about the runtime descriptions that the query is experiencing. So we have core and referenced. Okay. Next, we'll get into attributes. Attributes describe the columns of each table. But what we did, let me enlarge that if I may. What we did, we categorized them. So we said all the columns and all the various tables of which is text, the query, the plan, runtime stats, weight stats, all follow a certain template or category of values, which are IDs, descriptors, content, date, time, duration, counts, and usage. So the text, the query, the plan, runtime stats, and weight stats all have the same family of attributes, which are IDs, descriptors. IDs is who am I, who are you, can we talk? Namely, who am I, the primary key of that particular table or the row within that table. Who are you? It's the foreign key. A foreign key, which is actually a primary key of another table that we have a reference to. So you can see all these guys, all these attributes that then are inherited across the various catalog views. Okay, and you can read this further to get a further understanding. Now we'll get into the objects for more clarification. The objects are actually the entities, okay, that the query plan actually works with, or the query store actually works with. And let me just get back in the correct one here. So we'll get into cores. Again, we have the text, query plan, runtime stats, and weights. Let's look at a few just for an understanding. So we'll look at the query plan. This is the query plan, catalog view. We'll enlarge it a bit. Okay, as we mentioned before, this query plan, this catalog view will inherit the description of the attributes. So here's a real running of it. So the IDs, the plan ID, that's the ID of the plan itself, and that's the primary key. That plan also is related to a query ID, which is the compilation process, what happened during the compilation process, which is the compiled version of the text. So that's a foreign key. But I can take that ID and reference those attributes. And then there's another ID, and the query plan hash is ID of the query in memory. We talked about descriptors. So there it is here, descriptors, IDs descriptors. What's the engine version? What's the compatibility level? Is it a parallel plan? Is it a trivial plan? Is it forced? Well, all those guys sort of fall under descriptors. Okay. Now we're getting to the metrics of that particular catalog view. So what's the context? Well, the query plan itself, which is an XML object that you can analyze and get more information about. We mentioned that things happen within a date and time. So when was the initial compilation time? When was the last compilation time? And when was the last execution time? We talked about duration of the compilation time, the average and last. We talked about counts. Well, counts, how many times was it compiled? And how many times was the forced failure of the counts? The compilation, how many times did it fail during a forced failure? So those are the attributes described. We can look at one more. How about the runtime stats? Well, just to give you another viewpoint. Runtime stats comes up. We'll enlarge that. Again, these are the runtime stats. It inherited all the attributes from the categories. There's the IDs, there's the descriptors, there's the payload, the metrics, the content, date and time. When was the first execution time? When was the last execution time? As far as the durations, this duration variable here, the min, max, last, average, and standard deviation. How about the counts? Well, how many times did it execute? The count executions. Also, the counts of logical I/O, counts of the logical I/O writes. The counts of the physical I/O reads, the row count. How about the usage? Usage in min, max, last, average, and standard deviation of CPU time, CLR time, DOP, right? Query max used memory. So those are all the different attributes. So we discussed a number of things here as far as the architecture. We discussed the components. We discussed the objects and the attributes. Into the core, we have all of the objects, which is text, query plan, runtime stats, weight stats. That actually ends it, and we did it in less than 10 minutes. My timer has not gone off. Also, if you just want to review the breakdown of the objects or the breakdown of the diagrams during the intro, just run the intro and just stop it at a particular screen you want to review. If you want to hear the lecture, let it continue and go into the lecture. And that kind of wraps it up for QueryStore. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll have many more topics to come. And I appreciate you listening, and I'm signing out. Anthony Padone. Bye-bye now.